Elizabeth Tippett, Professor Tônia Novixis, Professor Ana Virginia, Professor Adriana Calvo, and Professor Freitas. Now I would like to ask Professor Freitas to introduce the professors and the president of the Brazilian Bar Association and start the conference. So, Professor Freitas, could you start the conference? Professor Freitas?
Freitas, your microphone is not working. You have
Sorry for that. I thank you, each one of you, for the kind possibility to and the exception to join this important and challenging meeting that is devoted to contrast the reaction of different countries of the tragic pandemic that we are facing currently. But first of all, I'd like to give the possibility to our chair, our author, Caio Augusto Silva Santos, to give us a brief introduction of and in name of the São Paulo section of the Brazilian Bar Association. Please, Dr. Caio, muita honra tê-lo aqui presente. Isso para nós é muito lisonjeiro. E com a palavra, por favor. Habilita.
Me perdoe. Bom, boa tarde a todos os amigos. Gostaria de, primeiramente, destacar a imensa alegria de podermos estar realizando este grande evento de direito do trabalho, onde, na esteira dos ensinamentos sempre presentes do querido professor Jorge Castelo, nosso conselheiro seccional e presidente da Comissão de Direito do Trabalho da OAB São Paulo, onde, sem dúvida alguma, estaremos a aprender e a produzir ciência. Vivemos um momento de absoluta dificuldade, não só na nossa quadra nacional, mas na quadra mundial. E o compartilhamento das experiências vivenciadas por aqueles que já estão um pouco mais adiantados no tempo, quanto ao enfrentamento deste grande mal que assola todo mundo, que é o coronavírus, é de fundamental importância para que nós juntos possamos aprender algumas alternativas, traçar rumos, justamente para que a maior autoridade de todas no Estado Democrático de Direito, que é o cidadão, sofra o menor impacto possível diante de tudo aquilo que tivemos que tomar de decisões conjuntas. Por isso, quero agradecer aos professores que gentilmente estão conosco nesta ocasião e que compartilharão conosco seus conhecimentos. E faço este agradecimento não só na pessoa do nosso presidente e conselheiro estadual Jorge Castelo, mas também do professor Freitas e da professora Adriana Calvo. Muito obrigado aos amigos pela disposição em nos ajudar e, notadamente, coletar informações junto às experiências vivenciadas na Inglaterra e nos Estados Unidos, que certamente serão faróis importantes para nos direcionar alguns caminhos. É bem verdade que sabemos que as experiências têm as suas aplicações também observando os contornos das particularidades de cada nação, de cada localidade, mas é imperativo dizer também de que aquele que não conhece o seu passado não pode ter a perspectiva adequada do seu presente e tampouco almejar um futuro promissor. Por isso, o aprendizado com as experiências vividas, ainda que há pouco tempo, por outros colegas batalhadores do direito, sem dúvida alguma, serão fundamentais para nos auxiliar nesta caminhada. Por isso, a OAB São Paulo se sente absolutamente honrada com o prestígio dos professores internacionais que compartilharão conosco os seus conhecimentos e reitera, professor Jorge, professor Freitas e professora Adriana Calvo, os agradecimentos aos amigos pela colaboração. a Comissão de Direito do Trabalho, com todas as suas coordenadorias, tem trabalhado muito, dando oportunidade de fala a todos os grupos heterogêneos importantes que compõem o direito do trabalho nacional e internacional, mas, acima de tudo, a todos aqueles que querem o bem da advocacia e o bem da cidadania. Parabéns aos amigos, com a gratidão da OAB São Paulo pelo trabalho realizado.
É uma honra, é uma alegria estar aqui contando com a sua presença, presidente. Sinta-se à vontade, se tiver algum outro chamamento para se retirar. Sabemos a sua agenda, que é bastante concorrida. So, we thank you again, Dr. Caio Augusto. And I think it's just about to start. Let me here. Well, let me just make some initial remarks about the issues we intend to face in this afternoon here in Brazil, afternoon meeting. First of all, the local pandemics. Excuse me?
Freitas,
Okay.
I think you have to introduce the professors.
Yes, I will. I will. As soon as I just
I'm sorry.
Initial, no,
Go on.
initial words
Go
about
on.
the subject of our meeting. So the scenario, the type of government responses, we have some similarities concerning our leaders, our political leaders in UK, in US, in Brazil, unfortunately, I would say personally, but anyway, we also want to approach some labor measures adopted by the governments to face the impact of the coronavirus pandemic over the labor and industrial relations system. And especially, I think we could address very, very carefully the possible post-COVID impacts in the world of work. That is to say, what sort of normal we're going to back to. And if we're going to back, or if you're going to try to build a different normal for our environmental and social world. Well, I want to thank again for the professors that accepted our invitation, Professor Augustus Bonner Cochran III, or just simply kindly Professor Gus. He is Professor of Political Science at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta, Georgia. Professor Elizabeth Tippett, our dear colleague from the School of Law of Oregon Law School. She also teaches ADR, and in this agenda, she's been in touch with us from the University of São Paulo Law School. Professor Torianovitz, it's a very great pleasure to have you join us. Professor Torianovitz, Professor of Labor Law at the University of Bristol Law School. Professor Ana Virginia Moreira Gomes, Professor of Employment Law, Labor Law at the University of Fortaleza, Unifor, Brazil. And Professor Adriana Calvo, that teaches Employment Law at Fundação Getúlio Vargas School of Law in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Also, again, thanks for the initiative of Professor and our chair, Jorge Pinheiro Castelo, that is the president of the Employment and Labor Law Commission of the Brazilian Bar Association. So thank you again for each one of you. Thank you again for everybody to join us at this opportunity. And I would start, ask for Professor Gus Bonner, just to start for your initial remarks. It'll be probably fine 15 minutes. So I'm gonna mute my microphone and please, it's up to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor to be on this panel with distinguished professors and personalities from the OAB de São Paulo. I'm going to talk more about a sort of overview or political setting of the crisis. Maybe start with something fairly obvious, but just the scale of the crisis we've been facing from the point of view of the United States. For example, something like 80% of Americans were on lockdown during the month of April. Goldman Sachs Bank is predicting that our second quarter GDP will be down 35%. And predictions are that unemployment may reach 30 million by the beginning of summer or June for us, and average 10% or 10.1% for the year. So someone has compared this crisis to a national scale Hurricane Katrina that so devastated New Orleans in 2005. Someone else has suggested that if this crisis were an earthquake, that the Great Depression would be a perfect 10 on a Richter scale. The Great Recession, the crisis of 2008, might be an 8.5, and this COVID crisis could be a 9. So it's pretty dramatic. Our president, President Trump, was very slow, I think. People agree in reacting. He did not take the crisis very seriously at first. Somewhere around the end of March, beginning of April, he did more or less a U-turn and began to listen to medical advice and the experts and began more serious health policies. Although his daily briefings still demonstrate a lot of impatience and urge to reopen the economy and to discuss the economy, and in particular to almost turn into campaign rallies where he praises himself and his administration for the kind of work he's doing. Just to put things in comparison, I did a few statistics. We have represented here some of the countries with the worst situation in the world. The US, I think, now is leading the world in numbers of deaths, and Britain, I believe, is number 3 after Italy. I'm speaking to you from Georgia, which it's somewhat interesting to compare with Sao Paulo. We now are standing at just over 1,000 deaths and 25,000 cases. We have about 1/4 of your population. I believe you have 2,200 plus deaths and about the same number of cases. So we have about 4 times the number of cases and 2 times the number of deaths of Sao Paulo. It's also interesting, since Professor Tippett is from Oregon, my daughter lives in Oregon, so I follow Oregon a little more closely than most other states. Georgia has a conservative Republican governor. Oregon has a liberal Democratic governor. And if I left you with one thing, I think it's fairly obvious, but this crisis, though it's biologically based, is also a political crisis. And so if I compare Georgia's deaths, again, around 1,000 and cases 25,000, Oregon has 100 deaths and 2,500 cases. So we have 10 times the number of Oregon. Now we have a population 2.5 times, but roughly 4 times the problem that Oregon has, because Oregon took this crisis seriously from the beginning. The governor closed down things and things remain closed down. We were one of the last states to close down at the beginning of April, and our governor has already started opening things back up as of a week ago. So just to set the scene, we might think of the coronavirus as almost introducing dye into a system to give us a test to be able to trace and detect the stress points. If someone has a lot of time, I would like to do this myself sometime, it would be very interesting to compare this crisis to the crisis of 2008, the financial crisis, in which we bailed out the banks and avoided a Great Depression, but 10 million people in the United States lost their homes. We had unemployment of 10%. George Packer, writing in The Atlantic, has suggested that coronavirus doesn't affect everyone, obviously, equally. Minorities have been shown to be more vulnerable. Older people are more vulnerable. People with underlying conditions, health conditions such as obesity, asthma, heart conditions are much more affected. And he suggested that we can detect the underlying conditions of our society by introducing this coronavirus. It has really shown some of the problems we have. So I thought I might just say a word or two about that. One is, obviously, it has shown the problem of savage or hyper inequality in the United States. The Center for Disease Control gives advice on what to do if you're sick, and number one, their advice is to stay home from work, and number two, seek medical help. But in fact, many Americans, I suspect Professor Tippett will talk about this, do not have paid sick leave, and so in fact cannot stay home from work without foregoing pay. And we still have 17 million Americans without health insurance, and maybe 83 million in all underinsured. So it's very hard for many Americans to follow sound health advice. The second thing I would say is an underlying condition is we've had 4 decades of neoliberalism being the dominant political thinking in this country. It's masked now with a kind of faux populism, or you could say right-wing populism in our leader. But neoliberalism, despite the sort of pro-market, anti-government predisposition, nonetheless, the United States has already spent about $2.5 trillion, or roughly 10% of our GDP, in response to this virus. Someone has said that just as there are no atheists in foxholes in time of war, there are no neoliberal libertarians when it comes to a meltdown of the economy. Yet, I would say that nonetheless, neoliberalism has shaped our response very much. I think we have tried very hard to rely on private companies and the market to produce health and safety equipment, for example. I think we see neoliberalism in the phenomenal pressure to open back up our economy. So neoliberalism is a real thing. Third underlying condition is the political polarization of the United States, which is much more extreme than has been the case until this century, really. I think there are many factors. One is just the declining faith in government. It peaked at 74% of trusting the government in 1964. It's down now to 17%. We've also seen social media and the rise of conservative mass media like Fox News and talk radio has led to the fragmentation, and people live in different worlds almost in terms of where they get their information from. And we've seen the rise of what some political scientists have called negative partisanship, less pro-favorability of your own party, but extreme negativity toward the other party. So that even when it comes to something like this health crisis, Democrats have been much more likely to believe in the severity of the disease. 68% of Democrats believe that this is something to be concerned about for their personal health or the health of their family and friends. Only 35% of Republicans, at least early on, believe that. And then I would say the last thing is that we are notorious for our Calvinist work ethic. Some of my Brazilian friends say that we Americans live to work rather than work to live. And so it has been politically very shocking and difficult for some people to grasp that we actually need to pay people not to work, to stay home, even though our agricultural subsidies have worked that way. Professor Tibbet will talk more about the specific legal background, but let me point out three legal underlying conditions or frameworks. One is our constitutional framework, and maybe the most relevant aspect of that for this crisis is our federalist system. President Trump has been somewhat confused, as he often is on legal issues, about federalism. He said things like, I have absolute power and I can tell the states to do whatever, but that didn't last long when he talked to some lawyers. I think he's back down. And I think he's seen some political advantage in pushing the responsibility as well as the risk to the governors and to the states to take action. There's some advantages clearly to federalism and decentralization. The states are like laboratories for experimentation, said Justice Brandeis, but there's also been a lack of coordination in our response to this national and in fact global crisis. For instance, it's a real mystery to me and others, I think, why in a rich, technologically advanced country, we still don't have testing. This has been left to the states to sort of compete, to get tests and masks and all that. Someone has suggested that our governmental structure looks somewhat like an air traffic control tower with no one in the tower, and that's the way it's felt. It's also, federalism has also been affected by partisanship and political polarization. For example, the states and local governments are facing dire revenue consequences, and the federal government, there's some talk that they would like to help the states, which are predominantly Republican, and not help cities, which tend to lean democratically. Also, the personal relationship of governors with President Trump has affected their ability to get equipment. I read recently that Florida has had 100% of its requests to get equipment from the national stockpile fulfilled, whereas the state of Maine has only had 5% of their requests fulfilled. Second, we have an at-will employment as a kind of common law background to our employment law. This is made by judges rather than legislated, but from the end of the 19th century. It means simply that any party to an employment contract, the employee or the employer, can terminate the contract at any moment for any reason, good, bad, or no reason at all. This also interacts with federalism because this common law is state level, and so many states have modified this and constricted the discretion and power that this doctrine gives to employers. My state, being more conservative, would not have. And then third and related, we tend to have what people call a negotiated rather than legislative model of labor and employment law. We do have a national Labor Relations Act. It's very old, and some people argue somewhat out of date given the changes in employment, but protects the right to organize and to negotiate. We have also some anti-discrimination national law, a lot of that supplemented by states. So I think that's the sort of general background. If I could say just a word, how much time do I have roughly? Anybody got an idea how much? 2 minutes? So very quickly, about the main social actors. Labor starts from a position of great weakness. We have only about 6% of our private labor force organized into unions, maybe 18% of public employees. This crisis has brought on somewhat of an increase in anger and activism among workers. In particular, there's been an absence of protective gear for essential workers. It's also produced a real spotlight on essential workers, a real appreciation for how many low-paid and not very high-quality jobs are so essential to us, workers in meat packing plants, workers in the fields and farms, obviously workers in hospitals and in healthcare. There have been an uptick, an increase in walkouts, which are not protected, and strikes, which are theoretically protected, although not very effectively, I would say. Again, there are people who are arguing that this builds on a wave of strike activity that was already occurring, particularly with teachers and nurses, and striking for the public interest as well as their self-interest has been very interesting. As far as business, that has been very interesting too. The Chamber of Commerce has put incredible pressure on the governors and the national government to reopen and to worry more about the health of the economy than the health of the population. One interesting factor of our non-response or weak response has been that President Trump has been reluctant to use the Defense Production Act, which would authorize the president to mandate private companies to produce masks, ventilators, other sorts of equipment. But he's been lobbied very heavily by the Chamber of Commerce not to do that. I'll just mention sort of contradictory hypotheses here. Naomi Klein is famous for her shock doctrine, or she argues that in disasters, capitalists tend to use the disaster to roll back rights and advantages of workers. Other people have argued that historically plagues and other natural disasters like that have produced a real boon to workers who now become more important and somewhat more scarce, going all the way back to the Black Death, the plagues in the 1300s in England. And then I will conclude by just saying that I think this plague or crisis has caused us both to look backwards and look forward. To look back, I think maybe in the last few decades, we will question even more the globalized economy, in particular, the sort of centralized, highly interdependent division of labor and long global supply chains. For example, early on when people were saying, where are the masks that we need for our nurses and doctors? It turns out that many of the masks we import are made in Wuhan, China, and therefore not readily available to us in this crisis. And as we look forward, there are people arguing that this is giving us a kind of preview of what could be the new normal if we don't do something to deal with climate change, and that would not be a pretty thing. And then I suppose last, I would say something Professor Freitas is very interested in, that somebody has mentioned that this is, we've seen the system broken, but it's also in a way broken open. And so there are all sorts of possibilities put on the table by this crisis. And it could be an occasion for rebuilding our social infrastructure, renegotiating social pacts, and putting into place much better policies for the population and for the workers. But it also might be a time when we are in danger, particularly because of our right-wing populist leaders, perhaps. Thank you.
We thank you so much, Professor Gus, for your very brilliant background and overview about the political and social environment that we are facing currently. As you pointed out, the coronavirus crisis is a pandemic. It's also a social and labor problem, but it's also a political problem. I say it's as well as a political problem. So go straight to Professor Liz Tippett, please. It's up to you, Professor Liz Tippett. I'm not sure if I was clear enough. She teaches labor law, labor and employment law in the United States, labor and employment law in ADR and the University of Oregon Law School. Thank you. Thank you for.
Hi, thank you for having me, and it's always such a pleasure to join you. So Professor Cochran did a pretty good overview of some of the weaknesses in the way the United States regulates the employment relationship. As he said, the baseline rule in the United States is at-will employment, which allows employers to terminate workers really without any notice. So one of the things we saw in the 2008 financial crisis is that companies just started shedding workers very quickly to preserve their cash, because that was the easiest way for them to save cash. So one of the consequences of the at-will employment rule is that you see the federal government basically throwing money at companies to get them to keep these workers on the payroll, because they really have no obligation to keep the workers. So the federal government has spent, in the order of $2.3 trillion, essentially bankrolling employee wages. So what they've been doing is they've been feeding money to companies to pay their workers. So we first saw that with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That was essentially the first stimulus bill. It was actually a sick leave law disguised as a stimulus bill. American workers have no right under federal law to have sick leave. A lot of states require sick leave, but it's not very much sick leave. It's like a week or 2 weeks. And it doesn't cover this sort of extended period where workers cannot report to work because the schools are closed. And so what Congress did was they said, workers can have up to 12 weeks of leave, essentially family and medical leave. So they inserted it into an existing law on family and medical leave. But that existing law on family and medical leave was unpaid. So what Congress said was, we will pay your workers the sick leave. And it's like this formulation where you get 2/3 of your pay up to a cap, which is $200 a day. If you give your workers this sick leave for when the schools are closed or they're required to stay home. So we saw that, but that law actually excludes large companies. And we don't really know why Congress excluded it. We think it might have been from the Republican side, because the original bill from the Democrats did not include that carve out for large companies. And about half of American workers work for those large companies. So they're not covered by the sick leave law at all, which eventually became a problem as well as the economy started to crater. The sick leave law also provides 2 weeks of sick leave if you actually have the coronavirus or you're caring for someone with the coronavirus. But that actually has proven to be less important than that sick leave for workers with kids at home. What happened though was, when about half of workers were not covered by this sick leave law, is that those other workers started getting laid off. So the second stimulus bill from Congress funded the unemployment insurance agencies, because the unemployment insurance in the United States is regulated at the state level. And Congress correctly predicted that those state unemployment agencies would very quickly run out of funds, and that the unemployment was not going to be enough to tide these workers over. They also realized that one of the best ways to stimulate the economy is to get money directly to workers. So the way they did it was through unemployment insurance. So they took a page out of what they did during the 2008 financial crisis. And so the federal government is underwriting that unemployment insurance. They're paying for it. And they're giving workers an extra $600 a week, so they have more money in their pockets. And they're also covering a broader range of workers. So what Congress said in that second stimulus bill is that if you've been furloughed, meaning you haven't been laid off, but your company says, look, don't report to work, we'll tell you when you can come back, you're off our payroll. The federal government is treating those workers as unemployed and letting them apply for state unemployment insurance. Even if they technically have a job and at some future date will return, those workers can have some money. They have also provided unemployment insurance to gig workers. And previously, gig workers did not have access to unemployment insurance because they were not considered employees. But Congress said those workers should also be able to apply. So, I mean, part of what we're seeing with the massive uptick in unemployment insurance claims, those are going to be a mix of workers who were permanently laid off, as well as gig workers, as well as workers who have been furloughed, who can expect to return to their job at some point in the future. that's part of the reason, but obviously not the only reason why unemployment rates have just absolutely gone through the roof. In the United States, if you look at the charts, it's like unemployment rates, unemployment claims, and the 2008 recession is a tiny bump, and then it goes to, you know, March, and it just goes, it's like off the chart, right? So that's what we're seeing for the state unemployment insurance claims. The third way that the United States has tried to address the employment at will problem is another stimulus bill called the Payroll Protection Act. And the Payroll Protection Act gives small businesses, what we've actually found out is that a number of large businesses have successfully obtained those loans. They give them loans to cover their payroll. And they're allowed to take those loans provided they agree to keep those workers on the payroll through June 12th. If they terminate those workers before June 12th, they have to pay the money back. If they keep them through June 12th, that's essentially the loan is forgiven. So essentially just stimulus money from the government. So that's actually where a very large chunk of the Americans, you know, outlays during this crisis have gone, is they're essentially just underwriting the payroll. But there's basically no conditions on that. We haven't actually seen any change to the federal sick leave laws that would be permanent. Everything that we have is temporary and specific to the coronavirus. We haven't really seen any permanent changes to healthcare. The real problem in the United States is for most workers, healthcare is tied to your job. And if you lose your job, you lose your healthcare. And what happens if you lose your job is maybe you can apply for insurance under Obamacare, but that's going to cost you money. You can also pay, you can continue to receive insurance if you're willing to pay what your employer paid, but it's too much for people to afford. So that's not going to help. If you're older, you can get Medicare. If you really fall way below the poverty level, you can get Medicaid. But it's just such a patchwork that a lot of employers are losing that health insurance at the time they need it the most. You know, and also this crisis also reveals that the minimum wage laws have been inadequate in the United States. A lot of these workers that we're now calling essential have been receiving basically poverty wages that they can't live on. And in fact, what some workers are finding is that they make more on unemployment insurance than they actually do by working. And that's only because the wages are so low for these jobs that we consider really critical, like grocery workers, like sanitation workers, like some of the home health aides who are working in our long-term care facilities for our elder population. These are all workers that we now see are essential, that are really living paycheck to paycheck and haven't been able to make ends meet. The last thing we've seen is that the efforts to protect workers' safety have been very meager. There is a federal agency called OSHA in the United States, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They're responsible for issuing rules about health and safety, but they've been criticized for not being aggressive enough. Employers really don't, or workers don't really have a claim of their own under OSHA. It's intended to be administered by the government. Unlike, for example, discrimination laws where workers can sue to enforce their rights, OSHA workers are passive. They have to rely on the government to enforce it for them. And so if the executive branch is not going to be aggressive about it, workers have very few options available. So what we've seen is the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has issued guidance on what they recommend in terms of health and safety rules in these situations, but it's only guidance. It's not mandatory. It's just advice for employers to follow. And so you also see these essential workers and also healthcare workers being very worried about contracting coronavirus on the job and finding that the protections available to them are quite limited.
Thank you very much, Professor Liz. Well, you still have about 2 minutes. I would like to ask you right now, what should be the role of unions in the US during this pandemic crisis? What do you think? I
think you see different levels of union density in different sectors. So for example, nurses tend to be reasonably well represented, and you see a much more robust union response to protect nurses in this crisis compared to workers with very low union density, like grocery store workers, like retail workers, those workers have very little protection. And, you know, I think it's, or Amazon workers, and it's very difficult because in general, it's cheaper for a company to violate labor laws over and over and over because the penalties are not that high. And so it's cheaper for them to just avoid unions through these illegal measures than it is for them to comply with their legal obligations and have to deal with a union that wants to place some limits on what happens in the workplace.
Okay, again, thank you very much, Professor Liz Tippett. Now we go straight to Professor Tonia Novitz from the excuse me, my daughter is coming. We are confined, unfortunately, from the University of Bristol. Thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you and to share a British perspective. Our story really starts, I suppose, on the 11th of March, when the World Health Organization declared that there was a global pandemic. And at that stage, the UK could be fairly complacent. We had 460 cases of coronavirus. We had 8 COVID-19 related deaths. And really the message that came through very strongly from the government was that it was very important to keep the economy going. And I think that's a theme that we're going to hear over and over again as we all speak. So the idea was that we would build herd immunity in the population. This was not a virus that would hurt many people, and it would only affect those with underlying health conditions, and we didn't really need to worry about them. It was only really when there was some academic modeling done, which demonstrated that if we kept on going as we were going, allowing community transmission, that we were looking at potentially more than 500,000 deaths. And at that stage, the government decided that they would now do things a little differently. And they started staggering in measures from the 20th of March. Just to give you a brief snapshot of where we are now, we now have 171,000 cases, and we have over 26,000 deaths, 674 in the last 24 hours. So we are really in crisis. And it's interesting. So what happened today is that Boris Johnson came back from illness because he's had the coronavirus and he's been seriously ill. He also came back from paternity leave because he's just had a baby boy. And he declared that we are now past the peak. So what he said is that we now needed to set up a comprehensive plan to adjust our lockdown and to suppress the disease, but also importantly, he said to restart the economy. He said that this had been a vast peak and we shouldn't allow ourselves to have to climb an even bigger mountain, but it looks like the lockdown, which is due to expire on the 7th of May, will be significantly eased at that time and probably due to pressures from business. There are 5 tests for adjusting the lockdown, and these are a little bit flexible. They seem to shift overnight. It's a little bit like Animal Farm. What you see written down will turn about and change again. The 5th of these has already changed. It's not just that we won't risk a second peak of infection. We won't risk a second peak of infection that overwhelms the NHS. The question is how many cases this will cause. So what has the government done so far? Well, I think that you have to see these measures, as our American colleagues were saying, in the light of existing UK employment law and minimal protections from dismissal and differences of employment status between employees who get the best forms of protection, workers who get protection around wages and working time and holidays, and some health and safety, and largely precarious workers working casually, gig economy workers who receive no protections. There are 3 key measures which are really employment related, which have been taken by the government. But I think it's important to note that before even the lockdown began on the 17th of March, the Chancellor set out various measures for business to assist them in a package. And that initial package totaled £330 billion. So the immediate concern was keeping business and the economy going. And these measures followed afterwards. So what happened was that provision for statutory sick pay was changed. It would be available from day 1, not day 4, which it normally is. The basic level of our unemployment benefit universal credit was raised basically by £20 a week. We created a coronavirus job retention scheme. It didn't start by having a statutory basis. It finally does so now. There's a Treasury declaration made under our Coronavirus Act. But what's interesting about this is that it involves a slightly different form of furlough to that which Elizabeth mentioned. So in our form of furlough, the employer really does have to keep the employee on, but has to ensure that they do absolutely no work whatsoever. And if that is done, then the employer can apply for compensation for their wages, up to 80% of their wages, and up to a maximum of £2,500 a month. But it's really on the employer to decide whether they want to furlough, to keep these workers on, but give them no work and claim for the compensation, or whether simply to not renew their contracts. Now, officially, our gig workers, our precarious workers, 0 hours contract workers are covered by the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, but the employer has the discretion how to treat them and has the discretion under our employment law and therefore has further discretion in other ways. So in reality, we are seeing quite a large uptake under the Job Retention Scheme. It's estimated at the moment that about 43% of all employees have been furloughed and 15% have been made redundant. We know that as of the 10th of April, 1.5 million applied for our unemployment benefit universal credit, but we don't have any recent statistics. So we are still waiting on that. The other thing I suppose I should highlight is that there are a lot of workers in the labour market who are treated as self-employed for tax purposes. And they're catered for under a self-employed income support scheme. Now, under our job retention scheme, the employer keeps paying you and claims that back. Under the self-employed income support scheme, the government will contact you and let you know that you can have up to 80% of your profits as a self-employed person. Now, if you're a gig worker, for instance, that's not going to be a lot of money. But in addition, you will only get a one-off payment in June 2020. So you have nothing to support you in the meantime. And what we're seeing in the wake of this, you can see it in the Guardian newspaper today, is a flood of unemployed homeless people in London. So people living off the streets, and all the shelters have been shut and there are no cafes or bars to pass on food. So there's a significant crisis occurring. Those are not the only government submissions. There is, I suppose, most prominently a concern around health and safety for our frontline workers. It became apparent early on that a large number of nurses and doctors were dying of COVID-19 because of a lack of personal protective equipment. This is also a problem for our care workers, for our transport workers, for workers in grocery stores. And we're also seeing this discrepancy in terms of an overrepresentation of ethnic minority groups. So about 30% of those in intensive care and 30% of the deaths come from these groups. And that's partly socioeconomic, but it may also be linked to forms of underlying health conditions that haven't wholly been dealt with previously. Now, our National Health Service is free to access, so it's a very different situation to the US. And there is tremendous affection and admiration, I would say, for the NHS workers. So in 5 minutes, you will probably hear through my front door all my neighbors cheering the NHS. Normally I would be out there because there's a street party that happens on my street, and we cheer and we communicate through a WhatsApp group and Facebook groups, and we do each other's shopping, and there is tremendous community spirit as part of this. But it's not just for the NHS workers, it's all for the key frontline workers who are doing work at the moment. I'll just come back to that shortly. In terms of the role of the social partners, well, the social partners have been consulted over the two key schemes, the self-employed insurance scheme and also the job retention scheme, but they weren't able to do much. They've tinkered with the details, but really these are schemes for business rather than for vulnerable workers. What the TUC has really pushed for is to start acknowledging the gender imbalance of how working from home has operated. So they're asking for greater sick pay, greater support for care for children, acknowledgement that women are doing a dual role, often by working at home and homeschooling. They've also asked, Trades Union Council has asked for a National Council for Reconstruction and Recovery. It's going to be very interesting to see whether they are actually involved in crafting Boris Johnson's new exciting plan for restarting the economy. In terms of the future, I think that there are various things that I would say are going to possibly reshape the future of work in the UK and possibly elsewhere. One is that health and safety at work has become such a crucial issue. And it's interesting that in the ILO at the International Labour Conference, there was a resolution on trying to make health and safety one of the fundamental principles and rights at work. And it will be really interesting to see how that's taken up internationally, I think. Within the UK, there has been this real change in valuation of health workers, but also an acknowledgement that most of them are actually migrant workers. So the people who treated our Prime Minister, we praised afterwards as nurses, were from New Zealand and from Portugal. And it's going to be interesting to see if they actually do relax the entitlement of migrant NHS workers. They have to pay a surcharge at the moment. They're the only group that has to pay a surcharge to use the NHS. And that's a huge problem in the UK around pregnancy, around cancer treatment, around various things. So it would be interesting to see if the attitude to migrant workers shifts because of this. The other point, I suppose, is that home working has become just endemic. So a lot of people are furloughed, a lot of people are unemployed, and 30% of others are working from home. And the impact in terms of pollution is shocking. We have clear blue skies, we have birds. We also have, and you've probably seen this on Twitter or whatever, we have sheep frolicking in children's playgrounds on the roundabouts. We have goats invading Welsh towns. And it does suggest that if you actually reduced the number of days that people had to be in at work, if it was 1 or 2 days that people didn't travel into work, that could make a substantial environmental difference, and it is actually possible. So that's interesting. The last thing I wanted to say very briefly is about supply chains. I think that this virus has, like a die, just exposed the horrors of our supply chains, and particularly fast fashion and the impact on the ready-made garment sectors and the ways in which people are now unemployed. And there is a huge concern about how we have been organizing production. Maybe we'll find a way of moving beyond consumerism around these things. But before that, there's a real case, I think, for effective economic redistribution. And I do worry about the capabilities of the IMF and the World Bank to arrange that. I'm also very concerned with the kinds of nationalistic messages coming out of Britain. You know, Brexit, Britain first, make Britain great again. You've got the same thing in the US. The withdrawal from funding of the World Health Organization is frightening. And there is also a question about how we arrange this kind of redistribution if Europe and the wealthier countries are being hit first. Who are we going to look to for the equivalent of our Marshall Plan to fund what seems to be now unfolding, say, in Africa? So I don't want to end on a gloomy note, but I think I probably have to at this stage, and I'll pass over to the other professors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tonanovich. As I was watching you, I remember that at first, some of my colleagues supposed that we were up to face a very democratic virus. And I think currently we have a lot of reasons to state that absolutely, exactly the opposite. So now, Professor Adriana Calvo, ready to? Okay.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you all, Tonya, August, Liz, Anna, for joining us in this incredible symposium. It's been a great pleasure to listen to you all and to feel your emotions, because once you speak, I can feel that we are in the same path, because you're feeling all the pain, all the suffering, all the anxiety that we here in Brazil are feeling too. I feel like we are brothers now, you know, like the same political issues, the same employment issues. But maybe in Brazil, because I think our problem is a little bit bigger, and we are trying to explain to you why we are so much concerned about the Brazilian situation right now. We decided that we're going to split this speech with me and Anna. I'm going to show the measures, the labor measures our government has taken, and Anna is going to close this panel with some criticals and some reflections about the post-COVID scenarios. Okay, I'll start with sharing with you my screen regarding the situation here we have with my PowerPoint. Can you see my PowerPoint? Okay, so first of all, just to talk about our numbers in Brazil. In Brazil, according to the world meter, in Brazil we have now 4,000.
Adriana, please, you start the presentation mode, please.
Stop the presentation. Okay, can you see the presentation? Now, okay. So I was saying that in Brazil, in the beginning, we were not so much worried about the coronavirus. I have talked to Liz, like in February, right, Liz? And she was asking me, what about in Brazil? Are you afraid? What are you doing? And said, well, in Brazil, we're not so much worried about this virus because we have so many other viruses. We have so many other diseases in Brazil. But then things got worse, and we started being part of all this COVID 2019 scenario. Well, let's start with the labor measures. So in Brazil, our first measure was on February 6, 2020. Can you as I think your microphone is open. Just a minute. So in Brazil, we started on February 6, 2020 with Federal Law 13979. This federal law was the first law which declared the COVID-19 as pandemic and as a problem of public health emergency. And by this federal law, the government could determine social isolation and quarantine rules. So from the labor point of view, this law is important for us because it was the first law which states clearly that any absence from work due to the COVID-19 would be considered as justified. The law just says justified. Did not explain who would pay, if the employer would pay, the government would pay. It's a type of paid leave. But our interpretation was that if it is a justified leave, the first 15 days would be paid by the employer. And on the 17th day, the employee would go to the government aid, government assistance, okay? But the federal law was not very clear. So we since the beginning, we had this problem in Brazil because due to the urgency, the laws and all the government measures, they were done in a hurry and with some technical problems. So we attorneys every day would wake up and see a new rule, and we would try to, in groups, WhatsApp groups, try to understand what the government wants with that. And this has been very difficult for us. It's difficult to explain to the companies, to the clients, what are the protections. And this creates what we say an insecure status, because people feel insecure to apply those laws. Then on the sequence, on March 3rd, the Congress approved the legislative decree number 6, which states the public calamity in Brazil. And the public calamity in Brazil was declared until December 31st. So during this period, the government is not obliged to meet the fiscal primary balance. Okay? Upon this declaration of the calamity, we had the employment measures. The employment measures, they were adopted by 3 province decrees, Decree 927, 936, and 946. You can see from the date, March 22nd, April 1st, and April 7th, that every week we had a new rule to study, to explain to clients, and to try to understand. And Gus, for you to know, usually these decrees, they were approved late at night. So it was common that we are going to sleep and then people say, wow, a new decree has just been approved. I think I lost 2 or 3 nights because I couldn't sleep after I read this, thinking about what the client would ask me on the following date, and how can I explain something which I could not understand either, you see, which is not clear, which is done on hurry. So for us here in Brazil, from the people who work with law, attorneys, judges, it's been a very hard time. It's not been easy at all. This I can confess to you, and I think Freitas agrees with me, because we have the media calling us as professors to understand the rules. We have the clients calling us to understand the rules. Here in the place where I live, the syndicate of the place calling me to know the rules, which was not easy. But what I want to point out here is that, first of all, neither of these rules prohibit from termination. So we didn't have a right-away protection of termination. So the company had the option to terminate, and a lot of companies terminated, a lot of labor contracts in Brazil. We know that Europe, some countries in Europe, the first measure they've taken was to prohibit termination during the status of calamity. But that's what's not happened in Brazil. This rule 972 allows some changes in the labor contract. These changes are a flexibilization of some institutes we have already had in our labor code. So for example, the teleworking, we had the possibility of having teleworking, but we didn't have specific rules to do it on an urgent basis. For example, the PD 927 says that you just need to notify the employee in 48 hours that you're going to adopt the teleworking. So it's a flexibilization of the labor code. Individual and collective vacations, we have those rules on our labor code. But on our labor code, to grant individual vacation, you have to notify the employee 30 days in advance. And it's not possible on a calamity, you wait for 30 days. So this rule says you don't need to wait the 30 days. You can notify the employee in 48 hours. So all these flexibilizations were very helpful at this moment, since our labor codes did not have a very secure strategy to follow. So this opened some possibilities for employers at this moment to try to decide whether they terminate or whether they adopt one of them. You have the compensation of hours, what we call in Brazil bank of hours. So if you can't adopt the teleworking because of your economic activity, the employee can continue to receive salary, but these hours that he has not worked can be compensated in the future in a period of 18 months. It's another possibility. The FGTS, the severance pay fund, the government.
Professor Adriana, just sorry to interrupt you, but I provided you in the presentation the PowerPoint just to tell you that you have additional 5 minutes, okay? Sorry.
Just finishing this. So the FGTS, the government offered the possibility for the employers not to pay the FGTS on March, April, and May, and start paying from June. So this was a helpful measure too. And suspension of labor rules of safety and occupational health. This was very criticized in Brazil, suspending the labor rules in a time where people more needed. This is something a little bit polemic in Brazil. And then PD 936 allows two measures: reduction of working hours and working schedule. You could reduce 75%, 50%, or 25% with a reduction of salary, or you could opt a temporary suspension of the employment contract for a maximum period of 60 days. This PhD 936 allows that you choose one of these options just by directly negotiating with employee and employee. And this was a very polemic issue in Brazil because it excluded the unions of this negotiation regarding these standards of wages, salaries, just the employees which received between $60, $17 and $2,004, $3,000, it was mandatory celebrating agreements with the union. The other employees, you could just settle with a common employee employment agreement. And you can, I don't know if you're aware, but our Supreme Court said that this was constitutional. And this was a very surprising decision. I don't have time to talk about this decision right now, but this was a very important decision for us. And then if you adopt the reduction or the suspension, you would pay what we call EEIPB, which is a payment paid by the government from from what we call unemployment insurance. So the employee would receive an amount of money from the government from the unemployment insurance. And companies with revenues over 4,800 million per year in reais would have to pay a complementary non-salary payment of 30% of the employee salaries. And if you opt to reduce the salaries or suspend the salaries, taking advantage of this government aid, the employees would have tenured status. The tenured period would be equal to the period of the suspension. So if you opt to suspend the labor contract for 30 days, you could not terminate the employee after 30 days at the end of this suspension. So these are, in a very quick explanation of the main measures that the Brazilian government tried to apply to the former employees. Okay, just to finish, just let me just show you to them an image. Can you see this image? Let me see. Can you see an image? This is just for you to see, Gus, Antonia, and Liz, what we are facing right now. So the Supreme Federal Court said that the employees can negotiate with the employers and see what is happening in Brazil. This company has obliged the employees to kneel and pray for the opening of the commerce. This has happened in Brazil. So this is what we are very worried right now in Brazil. What type of agreements the Brazilian employers will do with those employees? What type of situations we're gonna face in the future that could lead to those situations that for me, I consider it more harassment, corporate more harassment. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, my dear Professor Adriana. And so straight to the button, go to the final golden remarks of Professor Ana Virginia from the Universidade de Unifor. So I just would ask you, Professor Adriana, to close your presentation. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. No, it's okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, for your remarks, Professor Adriana. So.
Okay, thank you, Freitas, Adriana, Jorge, for organizing this symposium. So interesting to learn and also to meet old friends like Tonya. So good to see you. And sadly in a situation like we are all going through. But we only have 15 minutes, so I'll try to go straight to the point. That here in Brazil, we are also living through this unprecedented public health that has repercussions in the economy, in the labor market, and is also a humanitarian crisis due to the disproportional impact in the most vulnerable. So what I will do now is I'll try to analyze some of the institutional measures that Adriana has so well presented to us and trying to do some analysis on them. Wait, just go to the PowerPoint. Oh, here. Yeah. So first I will try to give some numbers, a brief summary on the labor market numbers, and the ILO has already published 3 reports with very frightening estimates on the labor market, with acute loss in working hours that will correspond to roughly 3 million full-time jobs lost. And in lower and middle income countries, like in Brazil, will have even higher rate of hours lost. The ILO also predicts that informal workers only in the first month of the crisis between March and April will lose around 60% of their income globally, and in Latin America around 81%. And the IMF has predicted the economy to contract 3% in 2020. Now about Brazil, we were before the pandemic already in trying to getting out from the biggest economic crisis of our history. So our labor market numbers were already bad. We had a high number of unemployment, around 12.6 million people in 2019. Informality reached in 2019 41% of the employed population, plus 7 million people who were underemployed, and 4.88 million people who were not even looking for a job anymore. Now we still do not have a lot of numbers on the labor market post-pandemic, but yesterday our Institute of Statistics has announced the unemployment rate for the first trimester, so it only covers March, and the isolation measures start like in the middle of March, is 12.2% the unemployment rate, which means that it's still only 1.3% increase from the last trimester. but still less, 0.5% compared to the same period last year. So what I think is we still do not have a very clear impact on the consequences of the crisis. The government also gave the numbers of the unemployment insurance requests, and they estimate that we'll have, compared to last year, 150,000 more workers asking for the unemployment insurance. And they justify, because they say comparing to the context is not such a huge increase, and they think that maybe it's a result of the 4.2 million workers who have already made these agreements that Adriana has said. But I think that it's still early to conclude because we're just in the beginning of this crisis. And I will point out some measures that I think are important for us to consider. And as urgent measures is essential, as Tonya has talked about, to strengthen policies aimed to protect essential workers and healthcare workers, especially ensuring that they have access to adequate supply of personal protection equipment. And in the policies already adopted, there is a gap in the lack of safety and health measures protections for workers in these areas. In the regulation that we have analyzed, there are no specific protections. On the contrary, there's provisional decree 927 disregarded the COVID infection as an occupational disease, making it much harder, even for workers who are out there working, to prove that there is a causal link between the disease and the work they are performing. Yesterday, the Supreme Court has suspended the validity of this rule. And I think now it's time to take the example of other countries like Belgium that are taking more effective measures to protect these workers. For example, recognizing the infection as an occupational disease for healthcare workers and for essential workers, workers that are working right now. Okay. Another aspect that I think it's important for us to think right now is that at one point people will start to go back to the workplace. And it is important that they find a health and safe workplace. I have copied here some guidelines from the European Union Agency on Work and on Health and Safety that deals with, for example, managing workers working from home, involving workers, taking decisions based on clear information, scientific information. I feel here in Brazil that there is a need for clear and uniform guidelines for employers when it is time to go back to work, based on what is scientific known by now, in a way that companies will know what to do when they have to return their activities, and ensuring guidelines that go beyond using masks and using alcohol gel, but dealing with, for example, the safe distance at the workplace, the possibility of teleworking, how will be the contact with consumers, clients, students, in the case of professionals on education, specific information on the impact of the infection in each sector, because the ILO report also called our attention to the fact that different sectors of the economy will have a different impact from the pandemic. I also think that this crisis has, for example, anticipated some changes that are already happening in the workplace. For example, it has intensified the use of technologies at work. And this will immediately bring us the need to discuss and rediscuss issues related, for example, to teleworking, limitation of hours, the right to disconnect, the digital divide as a new form of discrimination at the workplace, because there are workers that do not have access to internet, or do not have access to good internet, they do not have computers, or they do not know how to use computers, and they might be discriminated or excluded from the labor market. It's also interesting for us to think that the telework, it was considered an atypical form of work, and this is how it is regulated in our code. But maybe after the pandemic or right now is already in a certain degree part of every typical relationship. So this might justify a change in the regulation. I think another very important topic is the protection of workers' privacy. The infection may generate new potential violations of workers' privacy concerning especially workers' health information. So it's important to reassure that health information are confidential, but at the same time to think on measures that will be able to protect other employees from contagion. And I try to remember, you know, some other disease at the workplace that had the same, bring the same type of problems. And I remember HIV/AIDS in the beginning when there was not enough information. So I think it's very important that we take measures to avoid this infection, to be, to create around this infection the same type of stigma. Brazil is very big and heterogeneous. I have students from Ceará countryside that tell me that there are people there who have been infected and they don't tell anybody because they are already afraid of being discriminated. So it takes me to the next point, is the importance of prevention of harassment, discrimination, and exclusion due to the worker's health condition or related conditions. And I thought,
Professor Anna, unfortunately, I have to interrupt you just to say, if you could observe one more, no, just one or two more minutes, because we have a short time for presentations.
Yeah. So I think I'll just be very briefly. Can you see here the two last slides? One talks about the importance of protecting vulnerable informal workers. That they have been the more affected by the pandemic, and there was this need of the emergency benefit. It was the immediate action, but after that, we really have to rethink our measures again against informality, because it has shown how it creates harms even to society to be able to react to a crisis like this. The state was not able to identify our workers and to guarantee that they would receive the help they should receive, because nobody knew where these workers were. And to finalize, I want to call the attention of what Adriana has said about this Supreme Court decision that has decided that in a time of crisis, in exceptional circumstance, it was okay to restrict the importance of collective bargaining. And what I think it's especially important is to see how the Supreme Court considered that social dialogue, including collective bargaining, was a problem, and totally in opposition to, for example, the position of the ILO, which says that one of the pillars of these measures should be collective bargaining and social dialogue. And it is possible. I'm finishing here. I put this New York Times article on French workers who have done a strike, and they were supported by the labor court against Amazon in order for the company to guarantee in the workplace access to personal protection equipment. So it is possible, and I think it's also an important time for collective organization of workers. I'm finished.
So thank you very much, Professor Ana Virginia. Would you please close the presentation?
Yes, I will.
Screen?
Okay.
Well, I think we have Unfortunately, not so much time to debate. But I was trying to jot down some words and ideas. Precariousness, inequality, public health service, role of state, social partnership, social dialogue is the end, the last part of the Professor Tonia's article on the Italian labor law. Let me see here. Right of disconnection that Ana Virginia highlighted, and right of privacy. But I would ask you, back to what? What sort of post-pandemic, in just a few words, or summarizing idea, what should be the guidelines of this, back to what, this new normal that we are and that we intend to build afterwards? Professor Gus.
The microphone, Gus, we cannot listen
Microphone,
to
yeah.
The scuba. I think of the importance of worker voice and what we've just heard about workers can contribute so much on so many topics, but even in a health crisis, information about health. We've had instances of doctors being fired, nurses disciplined. We don't have constitutional rights in the workplace in the United States unless it's a public workplace. And so
Professor Gus, sorry to interrupt you, but we have
yes.
constitutional rights here, but the constitutional provisions, as Professor Ana Virginia just said, is not respected. It's not
yes.
For the Supreme Court, unfortunately,
Yes.
which is devastating for us.
Yes, and for us, I think it needs to be enforceable not just by the courts, but I think workers need to be organized because only organization can ensure a voice.
Professor Lees, some final remarks.
I mean, I think this crisis has really revealed the critical importance of disentangling healthcare benefits from employment status. The problem is the United States has already spent so much money on this crisis that they may not be in a position to fix this fundamental problem. And I think they will find themselves in the same spot on some of these other questions because they're not going to want to add additional obligations on employers around leave, for example, at a time when these workers are already precarious and they're being threatened with termination at any moment. And so I think the path towards improving employment in the United States is going to be very difficult.
Thank you very much, Professor Lees. Professor Tonia?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because ideally we should have social dialogue and collective voice, and we should have it at the top level with our trades union Congress, and we should be able to engage in collective bargaining. I'm worried that in the context of the redundancies that are coming, that it's going to be very difficult to have bottom-up collective bargaining. And that raises some interesting issues because I would think what most people would accept in the UK is that the ways in which people are employed, the precarity of their jobs is a complete disgrace. And in particular, it's been exposed in relation to bank nurses, in relation to care workers who cannot afford to take sick leave when they are sick. They're not being paid to take sick leave. And so they have this difficulty of supporting families versus going and infecting other people. And it's a complete public health nightmare as well as a nightmare for them personally. So I think that there would be a great deal of sympathy for changing the law, but I can't see that happening under Boris Johnson's administration. What does seem to be possible is that unions might mobilize through litigation. And that's something that's being taken up by the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain with a test case. And I just hope that that's the start of some kind of productive collective engagement with these issues that might change things.
We hope so, likewise. So thank you again, Professor Tonia. Professor Anna. Oh, sorry, Professor Adriana.
Sorry. As I point out during my speech, I'm worried about the agreements executed, who has been executed right now between employers and employees. And I think that we shall see the results of these negotiations very soon in the litigation and labor courts. I think we're going to have an explosion of labor claims in this year in Brazil. Of course, for us attorneys, that's a good news, but regarding the country itself, regarding the economy, I think this could be avoidable if our government in the beginning had tried to do social dialogue. Maybe we couldn't be in that situation. Thanks very much. It was a really pleasure to be with all of you.
Thank you, Professor Adriana. One of the characteristics of this populist ideology is to underestimate the importance of mediation, party mediation, press mediation, unions mediation, and so forth. No, wait, my dear daughter, we are just finishing the meeting. And oh, no, it's not here. I'll give. So, Ana.
Okay, I'll save you.
So Ana Virginia, take it.
I will just finish in highlighting the importance of protection of informal workers. I think that we have seen, the drama here in Brazil for these workers to receive this benefit. And it's all due to the fact that they're hidden, there are not effective registration and ways to identify and to deal with this problem. I think of many countries, Brazil is already in the stage of taking informality seriously. And in the labor law, in order for labor law really to be inclusive, we have to take and put informal workers also in the center of our debate. And there are countries that they are not even able to start to think in something we have done here in Brazil. But even then, with so many limitations. Thank you again, Freitas and Adriana, for organizing the seminar.
It was a wonderful, delightful opportunity to have you all in the same. At the same time in this meeting. It was a very stimulating opportunity to think about the tragic moments we are facing, we are going through, and try to figure out how should be the most predictable scenarios that we could preview and that we could fight for. Thank you again, Professor Gus, Anna, Tonia, Liz, Adriana, and Georgie. Do you want to take some final remarks? Do you want to close the session?
Just to say, I would like to congratulate everyone that took part on this conference for their amazing contribution. And see you in next opportunity. Thank you very much for us. See you.
For sure, Jorge. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you someday. Very close. Keep at home. Stay at home. Keep safe. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chama para o pessoal também que está aí, estava aí nos assistindo, Ana Paula, lá da nossa coordenadoria. Aí tem vários alunos, Freitas, olha aqui.
I have a lot of students from the São Paulo, University of São Paulo School of Law. We have also the 400,000 lawyers registered in the São Paulo section of the Brazilian Bar Association.
Paulo Cunha, Vitor, muito obrigada aí pela presença. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado a todos. Desculpem as imperfeições que temos no domínio desse veículo, que é bastante diferente daquilo com que estamos acostumados.
O seu ficou mudo, Freitas. Danila, você pode derrubar?
Jorge, take care. Be in touch.
Take care.
Danila.
Danila, muito obrigado.
Adriana.